Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
The subject for this evening's discussion is, can Britain be an industrial powerhouse in the 21st century? Of course it is an industrial powerhouse in the 21st century, but can it be a better or bigger one, perhaps? It's my pleasure to welcome you to my colleagues here this evening. This event launches the collection of essays by a number of leading politicians and business figures, which has been edited by Damian here. It's published by TLG Lab. So on my far right I have David Smith, who's the economics editor of the Sunday Times since 1989. He writes a weekly column there. He's a regular contributor to the CBI's Business Voice. Joe Johnson, who isn't here, is a Member of Parliament for Orpington. He was appointed in January this year Parliamentary Private Secretary to Mark Prisk, MP, the Minister of State for Business and Enterprise, and his main interests relate to international trade and investment, sort of subject we're going to talk about this evening a bit. And to my immediate right is Damian Collins, who's the MP for Folkestone and Hythe and the President of the Channel Chamber of Commerce, and he's also a member of the House of Commons Select Committee for Culture, Media, Sport and Olympics.
I just wanted to say a little bit about why we decided to produce this publication, a little bit about, I think, what's in it, what it says. As well as editing it, I also wrote the chapter on the creative industry, so I might just say a little bit about that in the few minutes I've got. Firstly, and really addressing the issue for the panel today, I think we sometimes underestimate the strength of the British economy around the world, and particularly our strength in what I would call the, if you like, the making it economy, where you are making products that you're selling and distributing around the world, and not just the services that support them. There has been a lot of talk in the last 6 months about the improvement in productivity and output of the British motor industry. The fact, as was reported last week, that and as Joe raised in Prime Minister's questions last week, actually, the fact that we are a net car exporter for the first time in nearly 40 years, that last year Nissan's car plant in Sunderland made more cars in any one year than any British car plant in history. The strength of the Formula One motor industry in the UK as a world-leading resource are things that we should be very proud of and we should celebrate. When you look at the creative economy, Tech City, in Shoreditch, not that long ago, people used to snigger slightly at the Silicon Roundabout sort of East London Shoreditch idea, but it is now the world's third largest centre for the digital economy. You've seen companies like Google make significant investments into the infrastructure of the facilities there. People are drawn from around the world to that location, not just because of the digital companies that are there already, but because you also have proximity to something you don't have the same mix of even in Silicon Valley, which is the world-class creative, legal and financial services that London has to offer as well. But the question is, what do we do next? And I think in this publication, we wanted to look at two things. One is in different important sectors of the economy, growth sectors of the economy, which are important to rebalancing the economy away from an over-reliance on financial services. What is it those sectors need? What should we be looking to do? And also to embrace a bigger question, which is, should the government have an industrial strategy? Now, I believe very firmly not only that the government should have an industrial strategy, but that it has got one. And it's not just a case of saying because of the world recession, because of the difficulties in Europe, that laissez-faire economics, the government withdrawing from interference in the market are a thing of the past. But really saying that's never really existed. The Thatcher governments gave cash inducements for people to come and build their factories in the UK, and they set up enterprise zones, and they had tax regimes that sort of favoured one sector over another and favoured certain types of investment. All government has done it. But when we look at industrial strategy now, we're not looking at the motor industry in pre-1976. We're not looking at the days of British Leyland when the government paid people to build and make products that no one wanted to buy as a means of keeping them in work. What we're looking at is a strategy of intervention which is often deregulatory, about tax incentives and reductions, match funding and investment to attract additional funds into the economy in key sectors where we prioritise growth, and we think growth will come. And in that way, the government in some ways behaves rather like a company would behave. Companies don't leave growth to serendipity in the market. They plan, they invest, they have detailed strategies to understand where their growth, where their improved performance would come, and the government should think like that too. So that in some ways was the genesis behind the publication that we called The Growth Factory, which was to look at the ideas for growth that would form part of a modern industrial strategy for the 21st century. Now, I think if you look at the creative economy, I think it's an illustration actually of where the government's sense of an industrial strategy is most developed. And especially because Richard Wilson's sitting in the second row, I will start with the video game industry, which is a good example, I think, of the government making eventually the right decision, which is to offer a production tax credit for games made in the UK, and to match that as well for the television industry, for high-end television production, for animation as well, mirroring a similar tax credit that was introduced by John Major's government in the 1990s for the film industry. Now you look at these sectors and say, actually we're world leading in the development of video games, selling them around the world, in television production and film. We have some of the world's best post-production facilities. We have the technical ability. So we're not seeking to build an industry on an unsustainable tax break. We're saying we've got a fantastic industry here which is world leading. How can we make it better? Going back to Tech City and looking at one or two other sites in the country as well, the government, I think, can also play a strategic role in looking at how we create centres of excellence that enable industries to develop. And if you look at the creative industries, we can see that creative industries work well in clusters. Nesta did a very good report at the end of 2010 looking at the way creative clusters work, where you have a combination of different types of skills and different types of businesses that trade from each other and sell from each other and learn from each other. In some ways, that's the way that Silicon Valley developed. It's the way Tech City works now. It's the way I think Media City is starting to work in Manchester, where that is the fastest growing media centre in Europe and the second largest now behind London. Certainly, I think if you look at the development of Google Campus in East London, I think from what they say, what people say, it's unlikely they would have chosen to build something like that here rather than in Berlin if it wasn't very clear that there was government support, an indication from the government that it took it seriously. And even going back to the development of Silicon Valley, I mean, it was investment from NASA, from the US Navy, and the support of Stanford University that led to the initial development of Silicon Valley. And then it was the first big generation of companies that came out of that, so Hewlett-Packard and Xerox, and their research laboratories and facilities that led to the second big wave for Microsoft and Apple. And now is the place where Mark Zuckerberg felt he had to go to develop Facebook as a business. So there is a strong role for the government in supporting innovation and creativity and the development of businesses as well, and in the physical infrastructure around them, and sometimes in funding innovation as well. And we shouldn't be frightened of that. And I think if there's one message I would take finally from the Growth Factory work, is that the government should be prepared to share some risk in the way in which it engages with the economy and with entrepreneurs. If we want to grow the economy, if we want to be a centre of ideas, we have to be prepared to take risks. All good economies are built on really being a centre of ideas and innovation.
There are some very good ideas in this report, most of which I agree with. Those that I don't say I agree with, mainly because I don't understand them, but I think that's because they're too detailed and too specialised, and I will research further, but it's an impressive document. Let me just say a few things about industrial policy, industrial strategy, and whether there is a way of reversing the declining share, what has been a declining share of manufacturing industry in GDP. You do need to know what other countries are doing, and there are examples, and I think the government has been reasonably good at closing them off when we have been threatened with the loss of quite a promising sector because other countries are offering more incentives or better tax arrangements. I think there is sometimes a sort of, an artificial private-public ideological divide on this. Public servants can be innovative, they can be imaginative, they can be entrepreneurial, but they're not business people, So I think, on this, you need, public servants come up with very good ideas often and very good ways of doing things, very imaginative ways of doing things, but they have to work with business. I mean, they don't, in general, you wouldn't want them running businesses, but partnership, I think, can be very successful. I think where the sixth point, where the public sector is spending large sums of money, whether it's the NHS, whether it's defence, other sectors, we don't often take advantage of that in shaping our industrial base, our industrial policy, establishing, creative ways and new ways of doing things. The government uses its procurement, I think, in general, in a pretty dumb way, and I think there are many better ways of doing that, and it's a powerful spending base that can provide a lot of industrial success that could be exported to the rest of the world, and I think that is an underused resource at the moment. Manufacturing matters, of course, but so does location, and I think with a school of thought developed in recent years, which was that it was okay as long as, the Chinese could have the manufacturing, as long as we kept the design, technology, all the sort of smart stuff, as long as we could keep that here, it would be okay. It would still be, in some senses, our manufacturing. Well, I don't think it really works like that. I mean, I think, increasingly with modern industrial processes, they are very closely linked with R&D, with design, technology, all those things. So you need it, you need a manufacturing sector, a significant manufacturing sector for exports, but you also need it to keep that innovation going. It's very important in that sense. There is no need for there to be any conflict between deregulation and industrial policy. It's quite, it's quite logical and quite possible for deregulation to be part of your industrial policy. Sometimes the thing that is holding your industry back or your manufacturing back is the wrong kind of regulation. So deregulation can be part of it. It doesn't, people sometimes think, oh, industrial policy, that means more interference, more regulation. I genuinely don't believe that is the case. And finally, I just think it's very easy to say that nothing can be done about this, and that it is true that it's quite rare for countries to having seen over decades a decline in the relative importance of, if you like, making things as a proportion of the economy. There aren't many precedents for countries to reverse that and to grow that bit of the economy. But I don't think, just because something is rarely done doesn't mean we shouldn't try it. So I think we should be optimistic, we should be ambitious, and we should try and force these things through and to think big about the future of the UK as a possible industrial powerhouse in the 21st century.
Like Damian and David, I'm also going to touch on industrial policy in my remarks, even though my contribution to Damian's excellent growth factory was on trade and how we can stimulate export-led growth in particular. I mean, I would agree with Damian in the sense that industrial policy is now gaining credibility as something the government should have. I don't think we're 100% of the way there yet, and I still think there's a very lively debate internally in government as to exactly the shape it should finally take. For three broad reasons, people are approaching it gingerly. As both the other two panelists have already mentioned, this is because, if you say the words industrial policy still, it has all the negative connotations of picking winners, state aids, subsidies, distorted markets, and so on. Reason number two is because within the European Union, Britain has traditionally played the role as the single most vociferous and committed champion of the single market, whose tenets are free trade, open competition, and bearing down hard on disguised forms of economic nationalism in one form or other. And that's always been one of the great things that Britain brought to the European Union was this sort of clarity of vision as to the type of liberal market it wanted it to be. So Britain has pushed the hardest of all the member states for the completion and deepening of the single market rather than the balkanization of it into sort of more nationalistic economic zones in which countries, for example, pursue their economic ends through their own procurement policies or dirigism of one form or other. The third reason why the words industrial policy are still approached gingerly is simply because there's no money for it. We are cash-strapped as a government, and to a great extent that means the policy tools are limited to getting government out of the way. And that is one of the things the coalition is doing very effectively, is getting government out of the way of business. Corporation tax rates by the end of this parliament will be the lowest in the G7 and in the OECD. The government is trying to work on the supply side of the economy like no other government before it, in terms of the labour markets, in terms of improving access to capital. We're raising standards in education and skills. And we're also, as David said, doing a lot on the deregulation agenda too, working on both the flow of regulation and trying to cut down on the existing stock of regulation. And for me, I think if you're going to look for a slogan, I would say industrial policy today has to be about partnership, not planning. And I think partnership was a word that David mentioned in his remarks, and I think that entirely sums it up. And it's partnership not in a corporatist sense, because we're no longer in a corporatist type economy anymore. But it does mean that government's role is going to be as a facilitator and as a convener, rather than as a body that through some central agency creates a sort of a replica of the 1965 economic plan. It's still early days, but we have seen some public pronouncements that are clearly giving a sense of where the government is going with it. Vince Cable has been the clearest, I would say, thus far, in stating his belief that market forces are insufficient for creating the long-term industrial capacities we need, and he's called also for a strategic vision for where our future industrial capabilities should lie and how to deliver it. There is, though, still a sort of a free market Nigel Lawson wing of the party that basically believes that the state should remain neutral as to how people make their money, that are concerned at the list of sectors that should, in some people's eyes, receive sort of favorable government treatment, and they worry about the risk of capture and rent-seeking, and doubt that these risks can be mitigated by the adoption of clear principles for the selection of favoured sectors and for the governance of any support that might be given for these sectors. People who are sceptical about this new emerging industrial policy will also worry about the proliferation of what they have in the past seen as pea-shooter type initiatives, various schemes that are underscale, underfinanced, don't really amount to very much and kind of wither away after a while, and no one really mourns their loss. That said, I do think even within that group of sort of Nigel Lawson type free marketeers, there is a very clear recognition that the coalition government is moving in the right direction in terms of accepting the need for a more active role in rebalancing the economy. They're very supportive of not just, as I said, getting government out of the way and creating the conditions for business to flourish, but Damian mentioned the video games tax, and that's something which had broad support on the Conservative benches because it was felt that other countries are engaging in an anti-competitive attack on an industry in which we are capable of creating a sustainable competitive advantage for ourselves, and we needed to head that off. There is strong support for action the government's taking to rebuild supply chains in Britain. There is a great unease throughout the Conservative Party at the way, for example, and I might get the statistics slightly wrong, but broadly speaking, a JCB digger that's assembled in the UK only a relatively small proportion, I think it's under 20% of the components are actually manufactured in the UK. There's unease at that sort of hollowing out of UK supply chains and support for initiatives to rebuild the UK supply chain. There is also support, even among Nigel Lawson traditionalists, for the government's commitment to export-led growth and to the push into emerging markets. Although by instinct suspicious of the tradition of herding businessmen onto aeroplanes bound for faraway countries, David Cameron and George Osborne have taken to it with gusto, and they've led from the front in terms of visiting countries such as India, Turkey, and many others. Lastly, just to sum it all up, I think there is very strong support for partnership, and I think nowhere was this better exemplified than by the action that Vince Cable and Mark Prisk, who's the Minister of State for Business and Enterprise, took through the Automotive Council to secure GM's commitment to the Port Ellesmere plant and to ensuring that the next generation of Astras was made there, safeguarding over 2,000 jobs in the process. This wasn't an isolated case, by the way. It followed Nissan's decision to build its new hatchback in Sunderland, and it followed a very strong series of investment decisions made by the Tatars at their Jaguar Land Rover plants. So for me, I think the work of the Automotive Council, if it can be replicated across a range of sectors, is a great example of the way government in partnership with business, rather than planning for business, can create an industrial policy that's very different from the industrial policy of the 20th century, but one which is fit for today's world.